Hi, this is Andrew Versa with Impact Soundworks, and today I'm going to show how I wrote and produced a Metallica-style classic metal song using all virtual instruments. Naturally, we're using 3 Shreddage instruments here: Jupiter for rhythm, Abyss for bass, and Rogue for a lead, as well as Tokyo scoring drum kits for the drums. However, a lot of the techniques and principles here can be applied to any virtual guitar. Now, because there's going to be a lot to break down, this video is going to be more of a general overview first, showing the different elements and the bird's eye view. And then in subsequent videos, we're going to get into more detail on the specific techniques used. All right, so first, let's play back the song. All right, I'm pretty proud with how that turned out. It's not a full song, but nonetheless. So the amazing vocals provided by Blake Inc., link in the description. So yeah, let's take a look at how this is done. Jupiter is playing the rhythm again. This is probably tied for my favorite metal rhythm guitar of the Shreddage series. You can see that there's a lot of key switching going on. I actually didn't do any customization of the default mapping because I wanted to demonstrate how a key switch style setup would look. So it's kind of constantly switching between sustains, palm mutes, power chords, and power chord palm mutes. Now, alternatively, we could keep it on, if I tap this key switch, just all mutes. But again, it doesn't really sound like how an actual performer would do it. So the articulation switching is a big part of the rhythm sound. And again, we're going to get into more detail on this in the future, but this is the overview first. Now, the bass is extremely simple overall. For the most part, it's just playing, the bass note, right? And for this, I played this in live first, and I just did some subtle quantization. And you can actually tell if you zoom in here how the notes are not quite perfect. That's just a result of me not being a great keyboardist. So that's okay, because I think that adds a little bit of a human element. With Abyss, it's the same thing. I didn't really change any of the default settings, so nothing too much going on here of interest. Now, the lead is, as you might imagine, the most complex part. It involved the most tweaks and adjustments. A lot of the techniques that I use here I've talked about in previous videos, but of course we'll talk about them more. Things like using unison bends on these first 2 notes. That bends the lower of 2 simultaneous notes up to the first one. A lot of manual vibrato using the pitch controller on my keyboard. This is pretty much all played in live and then just sort of lightly quantized after. I just find it gives a more human performance as opposed to clicking everything in for the lead part, even though a lot of it was not in rhythm. And that's especially true for this part here. This might not be 100% totally realistic, but I feel like this is a lot more realistic than if I just clicked in everything on the grid to make a sort of a fast, sweep picking type part. And then this, what do you call that? Dive bomb, right? So this is, very, very quick pitch bends all the way up to semitones and down. So things like that were a lot of fun to do, and it gave it that sort of classic metal flavor, I think. But yeah, we're going to get more into the sequencing and specifics in the next video. But next I want to show the mixing and production aspect of it. So let's listen to just Jupiter. There's really only two things going on here. If I take off the amp and EQ, we just get this. It's just using Shreddage Amp XTC and then some EQ to scoop it out a little bit. If I don't use that EQ, that scoops out some of those beefy low mids and then a little bit of the fizzy frequencies. Here's what that's going to sound like in context.
Come take a drive with me, burning in second gear, speed is a guarantee.
You can hear that it's just overpowering. Let's see, if I turn this off and then just decrease the volume by the same amount, I could do that to try to get it to sit in a little bit better.
Come take a drive with me, burning in second gear, speed is a guarantee.
So I could do that, but I think that the EQ change really makes the most sense. Those boxy low mids, it can just build up very easily on electric guitar. So we can break this down a little bit more. Let's go to a later part of the song and demonstrate maybe this loop here.
Supersonic.
So first of all, we're using all the gain stages. If you engage the clean channel, then you're bypassing two of the stages. Same with Plexi, except that bypasses just one. So we're using all the gain, and then we're also using boost, which is going to drive the signal through all of the gain stages. I can show you what that sounds like with boost off. It's not a huge difference, it's subtle, but I think it gives it that little bit of extra oomph. The EQ is mostly left as is. It's a slight scoop and then a little bit of hype in the bass and the treble. Really where a lot of the distortion is coming from though is the Klon Centaur pedal here, or we call it the Senator. So if we take this off, you're gonna hear it makes a huge difference. And then let's go later on to the fast chugging pattern here, just to show how it makes palm mutes sound quite a bit better with this kind of setting. Here's with off. This is our basic amp setup. Also, the pre-EQ adds a little bit of brightness. There's two different settings for it as of the latest version of XTC. Here's what it sounds like off. You hear it adds that extra bite and aggression, so I really like that. Now, one of the biggest impacts on any amp tone is actually the cabinet that's being used. I'm using Tokyo Cab Pack Volume 1, which is our impulse response collection that we have available. It's compatible with Shreddage Amp XTC, but you can actually use it with any IR loader. You don't have to use this one. But I'll show you some examples of what this might sound like with a different cab. So to do that, I'm going to disable cabinet A, and then we'll just cycle through some different ones on cabinet B. If we go earlier in the song, let's go maybe something like here, and we'll solo the guitars and just hear again how big of a difference this cabinet makes. Now you might think a lot of these sound way worse than what we have now. And that's true, but that's because the EQ that I'm using and there's some EQ pedal, and then there's also the EQ I showed earlier. These were all done with the cab that I picked in mind. So you can't just switch cabs and expect that it's going to sound perfect. You have to actually mix it in your track. So in this case, I went with this Bogner cabinet with the E22S mic, 2 inches away on axis, and then position 1. I believe the mic positioning is up and down, if I recall correctly. Now we could see what it sounds like if we change which Bogner IR we're using. Again, these are all a custom high-end Japanese Bogner cabinet. So let's just try switching some of these and see what happens. So it's interesting, you'll hear as we change within one set of IRs. So this is the same mic, it's on axis, but just changing the mic positioning slightly really does have a pretty big impact. But of course, changing the mic completely makes an even bigger difference. I actually really like the sound of ribbon mics on an amp, so the Royer R121 sounds really good. Now, moving on to Rogue, for this one, I decided to use one of the built-in presets, Metal Lead 2. This is basically all left exactly on the defaults, so it's just 2 amps actually, the AC box and a 5150 emulation. Cat is scratching at the door over there. But I basically didn't change the internal console settings too much. With leads, you usually don't want too much bass, but you also don't want it to sizzle too much. I think a common mistake that people make is they make the leads too bright. They actually increase the high frequencies. But when I listen to a lot of metal tracks, the leads usually are not that bright. So if we take off this EQ, here's what it sounds like. So it's going to get a little crowded if we keep that off. I was experimenting with using Soothe. I decided not to. I did add more stereo delay and some reverb. And then there's one more EQ taking out. Don't remember why. I think sometimes when I mix guitars, what I do is I just sort of scan through. Like for example, this frequency, what I would do is I would scan left and right. And then I'd see, I don't like that too much. I'd drop it. And I'll bet I did the same thing with this one. I think I decided that there was a resonance there I didn't really like. Same thing with this frequency. It can just be a little bit harsh. That was the approach for mixing the lead guitar. The bass had nothing at all. It's just the plain DI bass. There's not even any amp or EQ or compression on it. Guess I could have done that. For the drums, let's take a quick look here. Drums are not too complicated as far as sequencing. I played these in and then quantized it later. You can hear it's basically that pattern with some fills. Mostly kind of kick sequencing to make it more interesting. And then later on, this is a halftime pattern. In terms of the patch used, this is the Aizawa mix patch. So this is the one mixed by Mitsunori Aizawa, but you still have a lot of control over the individual kit pieces. So I started with the preset Metal Killer 2, which sounds quite good out of the box. The thing I messed with the most was the kick, because I think that's really important in metal. You don't want a kick that's too overbearing or too wimpy. So I think one of the things I did was I played around with the EQ to get just the right amount of like click and brightness. And I ended up decreasing the bass frequencies because it's very easy for it to get too rumbly and too resonant. So if we take off this EQ, for example, here's what it'll sound like in the mix.
Come take take a drive with me. Burning in second gear. Speed is a guarantee. That's what I want to hear. Every time I close my eyes, all I see is neon skies.
It just clutters things up a little bit more. We don't really need that super low frequency. And then this is the snare. The snare sounded a little bit too resonant in that range as well. I'm using Tape Sculptor on the entire kit output. It's basically just being used for tape compression. And this isn't just a standard compressor. This will actually color the sound too, and it can add some harmonics. It's very pleasant sounding. And then there's one more EQ as well. So this EQ is just to take down a few more of those resonances and things I didn't particularly like.
Come take a drive with me. Burning in second gear.
This is with nothing, right? Sometimes something can sound really good soloed, but not sound great in the context of a mix. So it's a little bit more art than science sometimes. I don't think there's any hard and fast rules to it. But a lot of the time what I do is I just play everything together and I just adjust those frequencies until I feel like it's sitting just right, rather than doing it in total isolation. Now, I will say there's a lot going on the master track. I think to get a really good sounding master for a track like this, you need everything to be glued together. You don't want it to sound flat and lifeless. One by one, first, there is a glue compressor. This is one of my favorites. I've been using it for years. And you can see that it's set to a pretty extreme setting. It's 4:1 compression. It's got a -16 threshold. So you're gonna see that it kicks in quite a bit. Pretty much constantly, right?
In second gear. Speed is a guarantee. That's what I want to hear. Every time I close my eyes, all I see is neon skies.
So that's providing a lot of the, well, glue to the track. There's a bit of mastering EQ on this, taking out the super sub frequencies below 30, actually increasing the overall bass, and then a couple dips here. I'm not going to go into a whole mastering thing, but same principle as when I'm listening to a specific instrument in the mix. I just kind of listen to the whole thing and adjust these, usually slight. If I'm increasing something on the master, decreasing more than 3 decibels, chances are I mess something up in the mixing, and I need to go back and I need to adjust that. The final important component is one of my favorite mixing and mastering tools, which is I Am Pusher. I'll play with and without it. So here's with.
Supersonic driver, make a demonic rider, and a bomb. Yeah. Never ending. Supersonic driver, napalm survivor.
I don't like to push this super hard. That's sort of what the glue is for. The glue is what is going to handle the more intense processing. This is like the extra layer of polish on top. Anyway, last but certainly not least is this awesome vocal part. You can see down here that I wrote the vocal first in MIDI, obviously, and I experimented with it first on guitar, believe it or not. It's like not bad, but I felt like this really should have been a vocal song, and so I thought, we'll save the lead guitar for later. I don't claim to be a songwriting expert or a vocal writing expert, but something that I do think is helpful is to at least try to sing it yourself. So I would sort of play the backing track, sing along, or play on the keyboard, experiment with just sort of nonsense words, and then make sure that everything flowed right. You don't want notes that hang really, really long. You don't want ones that are so short that it would be difficult to transition between pitches. So what we ended up with was pretty much spot on with what I wrote. The vocal processing is pretty layered. So we have 2 compressors, which is a technique I like to use with any kind of vocal, metal or not.
Highway drive.
There's a more intense compressor, a Pro C2 in this case, which has a high ratio. I'm using a preset called aggressive in the vocals category. But whereas the first compressor has a 23 millisecond attack, the glue, this has a much shorter attack, so that's going to be a little bit more aggressive. The EQ, we're cutting out pretty much all the low frequencies of the voice below 100, and we're brightening it up. So if I take off that EQ, you'll hear.
Every time I close my eyes, all I see is neon skies. Turn on the radio.
it's not going to punch through nearly as much. So that is the track breakdown and overview in a nutshell, but this is going to be a trilogy. In the next video, we're going to talk about the rhythm guitar sequencing, and then in the final video, we'll talk about the leads. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.